Hi, I'm Signe Myers Hovem. I'm a spiritual counselor, and I live between Oslo, Norway, and Boulder, Colorado. I've traveled the world. I've lived in 5 different continents, and I'm also a very sensitive person, and I call myself an empath. I distinguish what is an empath by somebody who knows that they can receive information from the emotional and mental and physical realm that is not originating from themselves. And they recognize this, and yet they don't take it on. They don't try to process it as their own. And they offer instead a lot of compassion and understanding that, humanity has varying degrees of suffering, and we are all connected. Declaring that I'm an empath in public was not something I ever planned to do, but I recently wrote a book called The Space in Between, an Empath's Field Guide. And I was motivated to write this book because there's a lot of people right now that use the term empath and empathic and highly sensitive person, and maybe don't quite understand energetically what that means. There are a lot of sensitive people in the world right now, and they are overwhelmed with emotions and with feeling disconnected from themselves, which is kind of the irony, because when you are highly sensitive, it's almost as if your sensitivities is a form of guidance, guiding you back to yourself and to your nervous system and to your emotions and to being mindful about your thoughts. There's somebody I know who once said the definition of terrorism is someone telling you who you are. And there are many people in the world today that feel as if society tells them constantly who they are, even though it may not line up to their own experience. And so from a very young age, we learn to conform. And if you are sensitive and you feel empathic, I would really ask you to start exploring this aspect of yourself, because it's one of the most authentic things about you, because we are sensory in nature. This is how we create a relationship to our environment. It's through our senses. Part of the reason why it's people who are sensitive are quite silent, or they're used to hiding. They create a lot of boundaries to protect themselves. And this perception of needing to protect themselves comes because there's not a lot of guidance out there in the world for us. There isn't a manual that your parents are handed at the time of your birth saying, here, this one's extra sensitive, please, this is what you need to do. And what happened for me and what finally motivated me to write this book is that if you look in the dictionary, every time I was writing about being an empath, I'd always get this cue from my Word document that it was the word was not found in the dictionary, or it would say it was origin was science fiction or fantasy. And that really brought home to me how hard it is for a person who is sensitive and intuitive and empathic to language their reality. When an authority figure or a resource as a dictionary barely gives you a glance and puts you into science fiction and fantasy, it doesn't really give you confidence, and it gives you a lot of self-doubt. How do you explain yourself and to others? And so just, language is incredibly powerful. It's how we create our identity. It's how we find our voice. It's how we offer ourselves into relationships. And so being able to say that you are empathic or an empath and not have somebody roll their eyes or go, well, what is that? This is what I hope this book will do. It will go out and it will open up the conversation even into the mainstream, mass consciousness about there are sensitive people, but we're all sensitive. some are more sensitive than others, but everyone can develop their intuition and develop their ability to have empathy and to be compassionate. Our life is created in a way that gives us empathy. If we take stock of what is our life experiences, your life experiences are going to give you empathy for a varied of your life, and what are your interests and what has happened to you, just as mine will. And this is what each human being, and this is what I said in the beginning, I've lived in many different places where I didn't always have the language, but what I could feel is that we all have the same emotions. We all have a degree of perception of suffering, and that transcends kind of a native language, and it goes into the human condition of that we all have a heart. We all desire love and to be loved and to belong. And for an empath and an empathic person who's struggling with that, to even just belong to yourself is a major calling. And one of the things I'd like to do here is I'm a poet. I love poetry. And part of the reason I love poetry is it very much resembles what it is for an empath who is experiencing an emotion from someone else, and you quite don't know where it comes from, but yet you have to name it. You feel it to name it, to give it form. And it was really interesting because I'm a fan of Cheryl Strayed, and she has a Dear Sugar column that she sends out. And in her most recent Dear Sugar letter, I'm going to read from it. It says, many years ago, when I was in graduate school, a few poet friends of mine told me about an assignment they had that required them to listen repeatedly to a poem in a language they didn't understand and then translate it into English. Their mission wasn't to know what the words meant, but rather to hear them, to feel them, to imagine them, and then to conjure them something from within themselves to translate the impossible mystery of those words into a poem of their own creation in a language they knew. I wasn't a student in this class, and I've never tried my hand at this exercise, but it stuck with me over the years, probably because as audacious and nonsensical as it first seems, the task is ultimately what poetry and life require us to do, attempt to make clarity and meaning out of the incomprehensible. I really, this resonated with me, and mainly because in my book, I am going to just read it very shortly here. I talk about how poetry and being an empath are kind of similar. My nature as an empath, feeling things while not seeing them, pulls me into spaces and places that are entered and not viewed. I hope any empathic person reading this description can relate to this aspect of immersive and experiential living. Empathic people are drawn beneath the surface and into a sensory experience of life. When I empathically register an impression from the environment, I'm aware that whatever it is, it corresponds to something in the physical world, like thoughts, emotions, or physical discomfort. Someone created them, so they have an origin. I may not always know the source or the relevancy of the object that holds the imprint, but I do know how it makes my body feel, and that's my point of reference. When I have a new experience that doesn't feel familiar, I need to sift and sort my way through until I can find a way to perceive it. If that isn't possible, I accept that I don't totally understand its form or intent. And balancing in this space of contact between an impression I've picked up and my own space can sound like an out-of-body state, but in fact, it's an in-body state for a functioning empath. The body is the medium, or in other words, there's a sensory component that reflects the environment upon the body, not in it. This is one of the most important aspects that I want to present to you if you feel overwhelmed by your sensitivities, Feeling something doesn't equate to being possessed or occupied. Instead, imagine that this space in between has a center, a fulcrum from which acceptance is cultivated and action is intuited. Thank you for today's opportunity to describe for you what it is to be an empath.